Welcome. Be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell, so you'll be the first to know when new story drops. Our protagonist, Mark Reynolds, a software engineer with a penchant for order and a deep-seated belief in individual liberties, had always considered himself a model citizen. He'd moved to the gated community of Oakwood Glen 5 years prior, drawn by its promise of manicured lawns, friendly neighbors, and a peaceful, well-maintained environment. He'd chosen a modest 2-story house on a quiet cul-de-sac, envisioning a tranquil life where he could work remotely and enjoy his weekends tending to his small garden. Little did he know that his sanctuary would soon become a battleground against the tyrannical overreach of the Oakwood Glen Homeowners Association, HOA. The initial months were uneventful. Mark paid his HOA dues on time, meticulously followed the community guidelines, and even volunteered for the annual neighborhood cleanup drive. He made polite conversation with his neighbors, mostly retirees and young families, and generally kept to himself. The first cracks in the facade of harmony appeared subtly. A notice appeared on his door, citing him for having a non-regulation doormat. Apparently, the cheerful sunflower design violated the HOA's strict aesthetic code requiring only solid, earth-toned mats. Mark, slightly amused, replaced the doormat, chalking it up to bureaucratic silliness. Then came the incident with the bird feeder. Mark, an avid birdwatcher, had installed a small, elegant feeder in his backyard, attracting a vibrant array of local species. A week later, another notice arrived, this time demanding the feeder's removal, citing concerns about attracting unwanted pests and potential bird droppings on common areas. Mark, increasingly frustrated, attended the next HOA meeting to voice his concerns. He argued that the feeder posed no threat and that the HOA's rules were overly restrictive and arbitrary. This is where he first encountered Brenda Thompson, the HOA president. Brenda, a woman in her late 50s with a permanent air of disapproval and a voice that could curdle milk, had ruled the HOA with an iron fist for over a decade. She was known for her meticulous adherence to the bylaws, her relentless pursuit of even the most minor infractions, and her complete lack of empathy for homeowners who dared to question her authority. Brenda listened to Mark's complaints with a thinly veiled smirk, then proceeded to read aloud a lengthy excerpt from the HOA's governing documents, highlighting the sections that supposedly justified the bird feeder ban. The meeting ended with Brenda dismissing Mark's concerns and warning him to comply with the rules, or face the consequences. The situation escalated further when Mark decided to embrace his passion for sustainable living. He'd always been environmentally conscious, and after researching various options, he decided to install a small, silent wind turbine in his backyard. It was a sleek, modern design, barely visible from the street, and designed to supplement his home's energy needs and reduce his reliance on fossil fuels. He meticulously researched local zoning ordinances, ensured the turbine met all safety and noise regulations, and even obtained the necessary permits from the city. He thought he had covered all his bases. He was wrong. Within days of the turbine's installation, a formal letter from the HOA arrived, demanding its immediate removal. The letter cited a vaguely worded bylaw prohibiting unsightly external structures that detract from the overall aesthetic harmony of the community. Mark was furious. He knew the turbine was not unsightly. In fact, several neighbors had complimented him on its sleek design. He suspected this was pure retaliation for his previous challenges to the HOA's authority. He decided to fight back. He prepared a detailed presentation outlining the turbine's benefits, its compliance with local laws, and the HOA's inconsistent enforcement of its own rules. He'd noticed several other homes with non-regulation items, seemingly overlooked by Brenda. He printed out copies of the relevant ordinances and even included testimonials from neighbors who supported his initiative. The next HOA meeting was a showdown. Mark, armed with his evidence, calmly and methodically presented his case. He argued that the HOA was acting arbitrarily and unreasonably, and that their actions were not only unfair but also potentially illegal. Brenda, her face growing increasingly red, interrupted him repeatedly, accusing him of being disrespectful and disruptive. The other HOA board members, mostly handpicked by Brenda, sat in stony silence, offering no support. The meeting culminated in a heated exchange, with Brenda slamming her gavel and declaring that Mark was out of order, and that the HOA would take all necessary steps to enforce its rules. Mark, feeling defeated but not broken, left the meeting with a sense of foreboding. He knew Brenda wouldn't let this go. A few days later, on a sunny Saturday afternoon, Mark was in his garage tinkering with his bicycle, when he heard the sound of a car pulling into his driveway. He looked up to see a beat-up older model sedan, a dull gray color that seemed to absorb the sunlight. It had no markings, no logos, nothing to indicate its purpose or affiliation. Two men emerged from the car. They were dressed in what appeared to be generic security guard uniforms, dark blue pants, light blue shirts, and cheap-looking badges that simply read Community Enforcement. No police department name, no city seal, nothing. The first man, who introduced himself as Officer Miller, was tall and lanky with a nervous twitch in his left eye. The second, Officer Davis, was shorter and stockier, with a permanent scowl etched on his face. They both looked uncomfortable, shifting their weight from foot to foot and avoiding direct eye contact. "Mr. Reynolds?" Miller asked, his voice hesitant. "We're here in response to a noise complaint and a report of an illegal structure." Mark, immediately suspicious, raised an eyebrow. "Noise complaint? I'm in my garage working on my bike. And what illegal structure are you referring to?" Davis chimed in, his voice gruff. "The, windmill thing. In your backyard. We've been told it's not allowed." Mark noticed that Miller was holding a crumpled piece of paper, partially hidden in his hand. He caught a glimpse of the Oakwood Glen HOA logo at the top. He pulled out his phone and started recording, discreetly aiming the camera at the two men. "Can I see your identification?" Mark asked, his voice calm but firm. "And can you tell me which law enforcement agency you represent?" The two men exchanged a nervous glance. Miller stammered, "We're, with Community Enforcement. We're authorized by the, Authorized by whom?" Mark pressed. "By the HOA? Do you have any actual police powers? Show me your badges and your credentials." The men fumbled with their cheap badges, avoiding his gaze. They couldn't provide any official identification, nor could they cite any specific law or ordinance that Mark had violated. Their story began to fall apart under even the slightest scrutiny. It was clear to Mark that these were not real police officers, but rather some sort of hired goons sent by Brenda to intimidate him. The whole situation reeked of desperation and a blatant abuse of power. Mark, maintaining a calm but assertive demeanor, continued to press Officers Miller and Davis for legitimate identification and legal justification for their presence. He knew they were imposters, a thinly veiled attempt by Brenda Thompson and the HOA to circumvent the law and harass him into submission. He kept his phone recording, capturing every stammer, every nervous glance, every contradiction in their fabricated story. "You said you're responding to a noise complaint," Mark stated, his voice laced with skepticism. "Can you describe the nature of the noise? Was it loud music? Power tools?" "I haven't used any power tools today. And my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, who shares a fence with me, is hard of hearing. I doubt she'd complain about a bicycle chain." Miller shifted uncomfortably. "Well, it was, a general disturbance. A report of, unusual activity." Davis, trying to regain some semblance of authority, added, "And the structure. The, wind turbine. It's a clear violation of the HOA guidelines. You need to take it down. Immediately." Mark held up his phone, making sure the camera was focused on their faces. "I've already demonstrated to the HOA that the turbine complies with all city ordinances. I have the permits right here." He gestured towards his garage workbench, where a neatly organized folder containing the documents lay. "The HOA's rules are not the law. And you, gentlemen, are not law enforcement. So, unless you can produce a warrant signed by a judge, I'm going to ask you to leave my property." The two men hesitated, clearly unprepared for Mark's unwavering defiance. They'd likely been instructed by Brenda to simply intimidate him, expecting him to back down at the mere sight of their uniforms. Miller pulled out the crumpled piece of paper again, glancing at it as if searching for instructions. We have the authority to enforce the community guidelines," Miller mumbled, his voice lacking conviction. "Show me that authority," Mark challenged. "Show me the legal document that grants you the power to enter my property and demand anything. Show me where it says community enforcement has the same powers as the actual police." The men remained silent, their charade crumbling before their eyes. Mark decided to escalate the situation. He pulled out his phone again, this time dialing 911. "I'm on my property," he said loudly, making sure the officers could hear him, "and I have two individuals here claiming to be law enforcement, but they refuse to provide proper identification and are unable to cite any law I've broken. I believe they are impersonating officers and trespassing on my property." The effect was immediate. Miller and Davis paled visibly, their eyes darting towards their unmarked car. They began to back away slowly. We'll just report this back to the HOA, Miller stammered. "We'll let them handle it." "You do that," Mark replied, his voice unwavering. "And tell Brenda Thompson that I'm not intimidated by her pathetic attempts to abuse her power. I'll be filing a formal complaint against her and the entire HOA, and I'll be contacting my lawyer." The two men practically sprinted back to their car and sped away, leaving Mark standing in his driveway, the recording still running on his phone. He watched them go, a mixture of anger and satisfaction churning within him. He knew this wasn't over, but he'd won this round. He immediately called his lawyer, Sarah Chin, a sharp, experienced attorney specializing in civil rights and property law. He explained the situation, sending her the video recording as evidence. Sarah was outraged by the HOA's actions and assured Mark that they had a strong case. "This is blatant harassment and intimidation, Mark," Sarah said, her voice firm. "Impersonating a police officer is a serious offense. And the HOA's abuse of power is completely unacceptable. We'll file a lawsuit against them, seeking damages and injunctive relief to prevent them from further harassing you." Mark also contacted the local police department, filing a formal report about the incident. He provided them with the video recording and the description of the two men and their vehicle. The police, unlike the fake officers, were genuinely concerned and promised to investigate. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Mark received a flurry of angry emails and phone calls from Brenda Thompson, accusing him of escalating the situation and creating unnecessary drama. He ignored them, forwarding everything to Sarah. News of the incident spread quickly throughout Oakwood Glen, thanks in part to Mark's posting of the video, with the faces of the officers blurred for legal reasons, on the community's social media page. Many residents, previously too afraid to challenge the HOA, were emboldened by Mark's actions and began to voice their own complaints about Brenda's autocratic rule. The tide was turning. The HOA, once seemingly untouchable, was now facing a serious challenge to its authority, all thanks to one homeowner's refusal to be bullied. The fake cops incident had backfired spectacularly, exposing the HOA's underhanded tactics and galvanizing the community against them. The fallout from the fake cops incident was swift and dramatic. Mark's video, carefully edited to protect the identities of the imposters while still clearly demonstrating their lack of authority and the HOA's involvement, went viral within the Oakwood Glen community. The carefully cultivated image of a peaceful, well-managed neighborhood, meticulously maintained by Brenda Thompson and her loyal board, shattered like a dropped teacup. Residents, who had previously whispered their grievances in private, now openly expressed their outrage and support for Mark. The community's online forum, usually filled with mundane announcements about potlucks and lost pets, exploded with angry posts condemning the HOA's actions. Long-simmering resentments about arbitrary fines, inconsistent rule enforcement, and Brenda's dictatorial leadership style boiled over. Several residents came forward with their own stories of HOA harassment. One family had been fined for having a non-regulation flagpole, another for planting the wrong type of flowers in their front yard. A young couple had been threatened with eviction for having a small, inflatable pool in their backyard during the summer. These stories, previously isolated incidents, now formed a pattern of abuse and overreach, all orchestrated by Brenda Thompson. The local news media picked up the story. Reporters from the local newspaper and television station descended upon Oakwood Glen, interviewing residents and demanding answers from the HOA. Brenda, initially defiant, found herself increasingly isolated and under siege. Her carefully crafted image of a responsible community leader crumbled under the weight of public scrutiny. The HOA board, sensing the shift in power, called an emergency meeting. Several members, fearing legal repercussions and public backlash, began to distance themselves from Brenda. They'd previously been content to rubber stamp her decisions, but now they saw the writing on the wall. The meeting was reportedly a chaotic affair, with accusations flying and board members openly questioning Brenda's judgment. Meanwhile, Sarah Chen, Mark's lawyer, was moving forward with the lawsuit. She filed a comprehensive complaint against the HOA, Brenda Thompson, and the two fake cops, once they were identified, alleging harassment, intimidation, impersonation of law enforcement officers, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. She also sought a temporary restraining order to prevent the HOA from taking any further action against Mark, including any attempts to remove his wind turbine. The police investigation also progressed. Detectives interviewed Mark, reviewed the video evidence, and tracked down the two men who had impersonated officers. It turned out they were not security guards at all, but rather a couple of handymen who occasionally did odd jobs for the HOA. They'd been paid a small sum by Brenda to scare Mark into compliance, with the promise of more work if they succeeded. They quickly confessed, providing incriminating details about Brenda's instructions and her overall plan. Faced with mounting legal pressure, a furious community, and a crumbling board, Brenda Thompson resorted to desperate measures. She sent out a mass email to all Oakwood Glen residents, painting herself as the victim of a smear campaign orchestrated by Mark and a small group of disgruntled troublemakers. She claimed the fake cops incident was a misunderstanding, and that the HOA was simply trying to enforce the rules for the benefit of all residents. Her email backfired spectacularly. It only served to further inflame the community's anger and solidify their support for Mark. Residents responded with a barrage of angry replies, demanding Brenda's resignation and a complete overhaul of the HOA's bylaws and leadership. A petition calling for Brenda's removal and a special election to choose a new HOA board began circulating. Within days, it garnered hundreds of signatures, representing a significant majority of Oakwood Glen homeowners. The community, once divided and intimidated, was now united in its determination to reclaim control of their neighborhood. Brenda, realizing she was losing control, attempted one last desperate maneuver. She scheduled an emergency community meeting, ostensibly to address the concerns of the residents. However, Mark and Sarah suspected this was a trap, a last-ditch attempt by Brenda to salvage her position and discredit Mark. They prepared for a showdown, knowing that the future of Oakwood Glen hung in the balance. The meeting was set to be a public spectacle, with the entire community, the local media, and even the police in attendance, ready to witness the final act of this suburban drama. Brenda, isolated and desperate, prepared her final, desperate attempt to maintain power, unaware that the community had already decided her fate. The emergency community meeting called by Brenda Thompson was held in the Oakwood Glen Community Center, a large, usually underutilized hall now packed to capacity. Every resident, it seemed, had turned out, their faces a mixture of anticipation, anger, and a quiet determination. The local news crews were present, their cameras positioned to capture every moment of the unfolding drama. A contingent of uniformed police officers stood discreetly at the back of the room, a silent reminder of the seriousness of the situation. Mark, accompanied by Sarah Chen, arrived early, taking seats near the front. He felt a sense of calm confidence, knowing that he had the support of the community and the law on his side. He'd spent the past few days preparing for this meeting, gathering additional evidence of the HOA's misconduct and coordinating with other residents who planned to speak out. Brenda Thompson took the stage, flanked by the remaining members of the HOA board, who looked distinctly uncomfortable. She attempted to project an air of authority, but her voice wavered slightly, and her usual stern demeanor seemed forced. She began by reiterating her claims of a smear campaign, and defending the HOA's actions as being in the best interests of the community. Her words were met with a chorus of boos and jeers. Residents shouted out their own experiences of HOA harassment, waving copies of fines and threatening letters. The carefully constructed facade of unity and order that Brenda had so meticulously maintained for years crumbled before her eyes. One by one, residents took the microphone, sharing their stories and demanding Brenda's resignation. Mrs. Henderson, Mark's elderly neighbor, spoke about the constant pressure she felt to maintain her lawn to an impossible standard, despite her physical limitations. A young couple recounted the humiliation of being forced to remove their children's small inflatable pool. Another resident revealed that he'd been secretly recording HOA meetings for months, capturing evidence of Brenda's manipulative tactics and biased decision-making. Mark then took the stage. He calmly and methodically presented a summary of the evidence against Brenda and the HOA, including the video of the fake cops, the police report, the testimony of the two handymen, and the numerous complaints from residents. He highlighted the HOA's violation of its own bylaws, its selective enforcement of rules, and its blatant disregard for due process and fair treatment. This isn't just about a wind turbine, Mark concluded. This is about a fundamental abuse of power. This is about a community that has been held hostage by a small group of individuals who have prioritized their own personal agendas over the rights and well-being of their neighbors. It's time for a change. His words were met with thunderous applause. The energy in the room was palpable, a collective sense of liberation and empowerment. Sarah Chen then stepped forward, outlining the legal actions being taken against the HOA and Brenda. She announced that they had secured a temporary restraining order, preventing the HOA from taking any further action against Mark or any other resident who had spoken out. She also revealed that the district attorney's office was considering criminal charges against Brenda and the two men who had impersonated police officers. Brenda, her face pale and defeated, attempted to interrupt, but she was drowned out by the shouts of the crowd. The HOA board members, seeing their power evaporate, began to openly argue amongst themselves. One member, a retired lawyer named George Miller, stood up and announced his immediate resignation, stating that he could no longer be associated with Brenda's actions. The meeting descended into chaos. A motion was made to immediately remove Brenda Thompson from her position as HOA president. The vote was overwhelmingly in favor, with only a handful of Brenda's closest allies voting against. Brenda, stripped of her power and facing legal consequences, left the meeting in disgrace, escorted by the police officers who had been present throughout the evening. In the aftermath of the meeting, the Oakwood Glen community underwent a dramatic transformation. A special election was held and a new HOA board was elected, comprised of residents committed to transparency, fairness, and community engagement. The restrictive and arbitrary bylaws were revised, with input from all homeowners. The fake cops incident became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of community vigilance. Mark's wind turbine remained in his backyard, a symbol of his victory and the community's newfound freedom. He became a local hero not for defying the HOA, but for inspiring his neighbors to stand up for their rights and reclaim their community. He continued to live in Oakwood Glen, enjoying the peace and tranquility he'd originally sought, but now with the added satisfaction of knowing that he'd played a part in making it a truly welcoming and just place for everyone. The HOA, once a symbol of oppression, was now a model of democratic governance, a testament to the power of community action and the enduring spirit of justice. Sarah and Mark continued to fight the legal battle and they ended up winning. Mark got a compensation for all the troubles, but the best reward was seeing Brenda's face when she was obligated to issue a formal written apology to every single resident of the Oakwood Glen. Want more stories of justice being served and petty tyrants being taken down? Subscribe now for your weekly dose of satisfying endings and unbelievable HOA drama. Don't miss out, click subscribe.